distinctly under intellectual out or something to that effect. But I want to start actually by reminding you, we're talking about democracy being imperiled, and I want to start by just reminding you of this day 27 years ago when, at least in my estimation, a substantial attack on democracy happened. I'm sure I don't need to remind you. And I want to bracket that by something else that I feel also imperiled democracy that happened this morning, or was it last night in Hyderabad? When was it that the people who the accused in that terrible rape case were all shot down by the cops last night? Yeah, I just saw the news. I told you a couple hours ago. To me, I mean, these are things that imperil our democracy. But going back to that day in Ayodhya, I feel like we're tasting some of the fruits of that in all these years since then, and in particular this year, in August this year. And I know we've had some discussion about Kashmir already, but I wanted to at least talk in these 40 minutes, not so much about what happened in Kashmir in August, but what the implications are for our democracy of what happened, and if we can make that little distinction. So I'd like to just throw out a couple of few small points and then get my panelists to talk to you. The way to think about Article 370 is as an expression of federalism. The conditions and negotiations that bring states together to form a country, to form a republic. And to me, therefore, it's a perfectly within the bounds of democracy to have a special article like that and give a special status to Kashmir. So it's just something that I think that we forgot when we said we need to get rid of Article 370. The way that Article 370 was abrogated, I feel, to me, was bothered a lot of us, not so much because it was done, but because of the way it was done. That we arrested a number of people in Kashmir, and then we, of course, all about shutting off the communications there in various respects. And the third point I want to make is that you put that kind of abrogation along with things that are happening today, like the CAB, the Citizenship Amendment Bill, and the NRC, and so on. And all these things, to me, perhaps this year in particular, seem to be striking at some of the foundations of our democracy. So I just wanted to put that out for you to think about, and then I've asked my panelists, I don't know if they've listened to me very carefully, but I've asked them to prepare a few notes to talk to you about. So Priya, you forgot? Okay, but here you are.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you to Vivek and his co-organizers for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here. I've forgotten what I fought with Vivek about, so we should have another fight so I can refresh my memory. But thank you. Yeah, there you go. Especially as he's conceded. There's a lot to say about democracy imperiled, one of which is to say that I would remove the question mark and say that it is to state the obvious that democracy is in great danger, not just in India, but elsewhere. It is imperiled, and the questions really for us are what do we do about this situation? If I might put things in a global perspective, it's a question that came up at the end of the inaugural discussion last night. Clearly, there is a surge in authoritarianism and chauvinistic majoritarianism all over the world, and India is no exception. And I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, was democracy always, in a sense, ripe for majoritarianism? Have we ever really had what one might describe as democracy in the world at large? And by this, I'm not saying, nothing's changed. Things have changed very profoundly. There has been a rupture in recent years, and we would be foolish not to acknowledge that rupture, even as we notice that there are continuities. But we do have to ask, was majoritarianism always our definition of democracy, such that what we see now is that it has come to fruition? again, going back to last night's discussion, I would say that apart from not stressing either continuity or rupture, but seeing both as existing in the present, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't pose the question in terms of whether India is in danger of falling prey to the virus of authoritarianism and majoritarianism elsewhere in the world. I would say India is leading the way. And this is something that I've been stressing in relation to Trump and to Brexit and even to Brazil and Bolsonaro, is that the rest of the world is on its way to catching up with India, which is far ahead, far, far down the road in terms of the abrogation of democracy and secularism and other things, and totalitarianism in one sense in this regard. In relation to Kashmir, I've been working for the last several years on colonialism and anti-colonialism, and I would say that in the Indian context, but not only in the Indian context, we have to think very clearly about the question of what I would call arrested decolonization. The ways in which we are technically post-colonial, but in many ways have signally failed to decolonize. We have kept the centralized command structures of the colonial state. We have failed to remove some of the most authoritarian and tyrannical measures and laws and institutions and administrative apparatus of the colonial state. And that has come to fruition in the abrogation of Article 370. So it's not just that, you know, it was there and it was part of a democratic structure. Sure, that was the case. But we failed to decolonize, and that failure to decolonize has come to fruition in what has happened in Kashmir, whereby you see an arrested decolonization turn into what I would call recolonization. And actually, I don't think that this is an especially controversial remark to make. We can see it very clearly, and we can see it quite poignantly in the alibis for the abrogation of Article 370 and for the militarization of that region and for the absolutely insupportable, unacceptable measures being taken by a technically democratic state. We are using all the excuses and alibis that the colonizers used in relation to India and to parts of Africa. We're bringing development. We are even bringing the bloody railways, which is what the British like to say about India all the time. We actually had people say we're going to bring railways to Kashmir. I mean, that is the oldest colonial excuse in the book. We are going to liberate the women of Kashmir in just the way that the Brits claimed that they were going to emancipate the women of India. And the definitions of freedom, the idea that freedom is basically about allowing capitalism and corporations and the Ambanis to do what they want in Kashmir, to buy up land and to run corporations in Kashmir. These are all, the sad thing is there's nothing new about any of this. This is the chapbook. This is the hymn book of colonialism, and we are seeing it sung in a different, rather than a Christian key, we are now hearing it sung in the key of Hindutva. So I think that the question of democracy and the question of majoritarianism has to be looked at with a great deal of self-criticism, and our failure to really to decolonize in any meaningful way has to be thought of as well. And in the global context, I would say that India, rather than following the West, now is in the unhappy situation of the West following in Israel, and then subsequently India's tracks. And so these are my kind of preliminary remarks on the question.
That's a remarkable overview of the subject, and I would like to, the question whether we are an imperial democracy, I think there should be no doubt whatsoever that today we are at an inflection point. And the reason why we are at an inflection point is that many things are coming together that is hollowing out the liberal constitutional democracy that we designed for ourselves 70 years ago. And that is being hollowed out in precisely, I think you can condense it into two ways. One, by building a physical infrastructure of a new kind of republic, where critics of the government and those whom it does not like can be treated as anti-nationals or termites, and whose voices and their presence itself can be suppressed, and they can be incarcerated or put in detention centers that are being built. So this is the physical infrastructure, which we'll come to again later, of a new kind of republic that is being built. This also includes in the infrastructure the building of a surveillance state, that with the use of the latest technology, as we saw in the Pegasus controversy that arose earlier. And then there is the legal and constitutional infrastructure necessary for changing the nature of the republic that we are in. And that includes both dismantling the institution the frameworks that we have, and building a new legal framework that legitimizes discrimination and subverts the idea that all are equal before the law. And Kashmir, the subject that we beginning with, I think epitomizes both. We see both the physical and the legal infrastructural changes that are happening. The dismantling of Jammu and Kashmir as a state and turning it into a union territory under the cover of darkness, and a deliberate misinformation campaign leading in the days leading up to it, essentially puts in place a new legal precedent on how a constitutionally guaranteed federal structure can be turned overnight into a completely unitary structure without any note of obstruction being heard from anywhere. As someone wrote, a union of states can now be turned into a union of union territories. So this is the building of a new legal and infrastructure that is very different from what the Constitution obviously envisages. But in Kashmir, there is also the actual physical incarceration of political leaders who have repeatedly been elected into the Indian Parliament, have sworn by the Indian Constitution, and have been political partners of the ruling party in running a government, in running a state government. So we have also seen the video of an Indian Foreign Service officer in New York actually suggesting that we implement the Israeli model in Kashmir in terms of new settlements and how to treat the population. So what we see in Kashmir is the building of a scalable model, a scalable and repeatable model of a physical and legal infrastructure that can find application across the country. And this has to be seen, this is important, has to be seen in conjunction with the new Citizenship Amendment Bill and NRC. It's important that we realize that NRC, the Citizenship Amendment Bill became necessary because the NRC, as it was being rolled out across Assam, it was seen to be stressful and traumatic to all communities. And this had to be, the citizenship rules had to be changed so that it is traumatic not to everybody, but only to one community. So that is the need, and that is the underlying reason for the change in the citizenship rules. And so what we can see is that there is a new legal framework that has been created and that is being ruled out and will destroy whatever vestiges remain of our constitutional and liberal democracy. And all this has to be seen also in the context of the institutions of our democracy becoming essentially handmaidens of the government in power. A democracy rests on at least three foundations: equality of citizens, rule of law, and checks and balances, to ensure that the rule by majority does not become majoritarian. All three are being challenged today, and I think it would be, and are in peril. So I think it's an accurate description to say that we are an imperilled democracy.
Thanks for that. Both of you mentioned something that I'd like to, a simple point that I'd like to just expand on, this notion of majority versus majoritarianism. And I find a lot of people get confused that. I mean, it's easy to say democracy is the rule of the majority, but so what does that mean? Who's the majority? You know, those questions are raised about that. But it's there's that step from there. Is that a step into what we are now calling majoritarianism, and how do we make that distinction, and how do we make it clear that democracy depends on there being a distinction between those two, and keeping that distinction? Would either of you like to address that?
I think I would depend on a statement by political scientist Francis Fukuyama, the person who wrote End of History. And he talked about, he was talking about what he calls populist nationalists. Under that label, whom he includes Putin, Trump, and Modi, of course. He said populist nationalists appeal to a subsection of the people whom they regard as the true people, as opposed to others who are not true people, and builds a direct connect with them, and accumulates power to themselves thereby, and then argues that existing checks and balances, bureaucracies, systems hinders their ability to deliver on their promises to them. And this, I think, is as accurate a description as what's happening around. And I think it links to your question in the sense that the appeal is not to all of the people, it is to some of the people in their nations who are the true people. And the others are the enemies of those true people. And that is majoritarianism, I would think.
Just to add to that, majoritarianism does not often refer to a literal majority, because actually majoritarianism in this country is couched in the language of upper caste Brahminical Hinduism. That's not a literal majority, but it's an ideological formation which insists, as you just pointed out, that it is the true majority, that its reign is democratic, that consent to that is democratic. But one other thing to say, that I think that often in our discussions of democracy, and this is as true of Britain and America as it is of India, we tend to focus on formal democracy. So were there enough votes to get Trump into power? Were there enough votes to make Brexit happen? But the question that isn't asked, and I fear that in the left in Britain, for instance, also accepts this logic, is did people vote on the basis of correct information? So what about the content of democracy? What about the need for critical education and truth to underpin democracy? So if people vote for a lie, if a majority votes for a lie, why would we then say that that nonetheless is democracy because a numerical majority voted for it? And I think that the emphasis on kind of formal democracy as opposed to substantial democracy, that I think is again a contradiction that's led to where we are today. And the other fact about where we are today is that lies are fine. So in America, in Britain, these are the other two contexts that I know really well, and in India, no amount of saying this is not true appears to help, because something declared to be true, whether it is true or not, nonetheless carries the day. And that's a real worry in terms of thinking about democracy.
The other thing that I'd like to shoot at you both before we ask our esteemed audience to chip in is you both mentioned Brexit and Trump and all these other currents in the world, Bolsonaro and Duterte in Philippines, and what's that guy in Hungary, Orban and Erdogan and so on. So I'm always, sometimes when some of us critics of this current regime in India speak up, people say, oh yeah, but there are all these other guys. So is that a worry or is it a consolation? I mean, do I need to feel relieved that we're not the only country facing this, or do I need to be worried?
I think we need to be worried. I think there is a reason, if I've been thinking about it, why is it happening at this point of time? I'm sure there are more intelligent answers, but one answer I think is obvious. It is that the lessons of the last century, especially around the world wars, have been forgotten. And there is a new generations across the world that haven't understood or grasped the necessity for the existing framework of liberal democracy because they did not know the dangers of what the alternatives are. And in India, it applies to us too, because even though we did not go through the World War experience, I think the lessons of partition and millions killed, and because of competitive nationalisms, competitive and hate-based nationalisms on two sides, competing against each other, led to the partition and the murder of millions. I think that memory has also fading. So we need to be very worried, because I think as memory fades, the danger that we will repeat history is very high.
There are no consolations in the present. I mean, it is, I think, an unspeakably grim time wherever you go. But I will say this, the difference between Brexit and Trump on the one hand, I don't know enough about what things are like in Brazil, but I understand that there is some dissent. The difference between these situations and what I gather of the Indian situation is that those situations are still polarized, that there is great division in Britain and great division in America. And people often use polarization as a bad thing, and I tell people in Britain, you're damn lucky that you're polarized. You know,
What you're trying to say is there's an opposition.
there is an opposition, and the population is divided. Where you have a real danger is high degrees of consent, which was talked about in last night's session. And the degree of consent here to me is very, very frightening. There's nothing reassuring about what's happening in other parts of the world, but the degree of consent here is deeply worrying. And I think Tony pointed out something that's true. You know, people often say, well, don't talk about fascism, that was different. I think we need to remember that fascism in the present day will not be wearing the same color of jack boots. It's not going to have a small mustache and be holding rallies in Nuremberg. It is going to take 21st century very insidious forms, and I think we need to be hyper vigilant about what those forms are, instead of saying, oh, come on, don't make those comparisons to Hitler. No one is saying that this is exactly like Germany in the 1930s, but there are warning signals, and we are ignoring them, I think, at our peril. But there is no consolation to be had pretty much anywhere in the world.
So, as with any session, I think it becomes more fruitful if we have some of you asking questions. So,
I'll take the opportunity to ask a question myself. It's about, we're asking about why are these processes taking place all over the world. And one of the topics which is not showing up in our conversation so far, it's early in the festival, is the question of climate change. Okay, and if you don't mind, I'd like to bring it up here, which is, I read a very depressing quote recently, which is that all of you, if you are roughly the age of 50, which is what I am today, you are, wherever you live in the world, chances are you're going to die in your 70s in a refugee camp in a non-democratic state without medical care. And it could be that these majoritarian impulses that we're seeing around the world are a reflection of a kind of a building anxiety about climate change, that the societies that we live in are falling apart, and that in a sense we have to create harder societies to deal with that. If you don't mind, we'll start with that question and then a response from everyone on the stage.
no, so are you saying that you're asking the question about whether these trends are a response to climate change?
I'm asking whether the catastrophic scenarios that are appearing on the horizon, whether these are parts, this may be one of the impulses that's threatening democracy or democratic processes.
Either of you like to attempt that?
Very, very interesting. But I would say, if this was indeed an issue on top of the mind of the people in general, that would show up in the political process as a demand. We do not see that. In fact, we see the reverse. But I think there's a point in what you said. If this is an issue on top of the mind of the elite and who want to create a harder society to deal with it, then that could be right. They will not be speaking the same language, but they will be, could be the underlying driver for some of these?
That's a really good question, and I would say that my answer to that is that apocalyptic scenario is going to be added to the mix. It's not quite there yet. Once that starts to happen, the scenario that you outlined is going to just add to our woes. The reason I think that that hasn't quite happened yet is that A, it hasn't sunk in for most populations that climate change is an apocalyptic reality. But the other thing is that the majoritarianism that we're seeing now is actually not from below. It's majoritarianism, which is about the elites appropriating grievances and then packaging them as though they were from below. But actually what we have is elites guiding the process. The people who are driving climate change, the people who are not willing to take the steps needed to decarbonize, are this, like Trump, are the same people who are also climate change deniers on the one hand, but are pretending to be the voice of the people. And the point is that they're not. And in fact, the people and those anxieties have not yet been factored into the process. And once they are, we're in real trouble.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Gadgeton, and the question is to the panel about checks and balances, because a democracy actually rests on checks and balances. But we are talking. Yesterday, we had fabulous talks. We're all upset about what's happening in the country. But you have a president who wakes up at 5 in the morning to revoke president's rule. You have a judiciary which takes its own sweet time to respond to Kashmir, and then give a judgment on Babri. So the question is, we can talk about it, but what can we do about it? Because we'll have sessions like this, we'll talk about it, go back. What's the action point?
Vote them out. I said vote them out.
I mean, I would echo something of what Priya Ramani said yesterday, which is we have to break the consent. The levels of consent are high, and of course, partly because the media has fallen in line, and that's true in other places as well. But I think we need dissent. We need to bring dissent back, and we actually need to be fomenting dissent. Because if we don't break the high levels of consent, you can't actually have institutions doing checks and balances, because those institutions will inevitably fall in line as well. There has to be, the institutions can't be relied on to do the checks and balances, because the institutions themselves need to be held to account. And no one is, for instance, really holding, beyond a few brave people, holding the judiciary to account at this point. Everyone's clapping as they do what they're doing, and that's a real worry.
I would like to build on a point that Priyamvada made earlier about the consent or the lack of polarization. I think it was most visible to us just yesterday when 4 people were shot down, accused in the rape and murder of a veterinarian in Hyderabad. That by itself is horrifying, that we said bye to good process. But what is even more horrifying is that the vast majority of people that you can see in the social media and elsewhere are in support of it. That is the really horrifying part. And therefore, the challenge is to change mindsets and to among the people that we are in, among everybody. So we all need to speak up, not just in a political sense. I think in a family setup, in whatever situations that we are in, we need to speak up and make sure that everybody knows that there is another strong side to this, and the voices are polarized on this, and that we also need to consistently disturb the fake news that is being spread, because that's the biggest danger that I can see. Because why are people this way? Because they're consuming absolute fake news that is being spread through WhatsApp and other means. So it is today it is a personal responsibility of everybody who is worried by this to speak up.
I just wanted to, I started by saying vote them out, and I want to just make that little point about the ultimate checks and balances that each of us do have. The ultimate check we have is that one vote that we have. And one aspect of that is not enough of us vote, and the other aspect of that is we vote for the wrong people. So I don't want to, I don't want that to us to forget that, that's all. Mr. You're asking a question.
Yeah, I believe that the situation in which we are today is neither all of a sudden nor it has been surprising. That the apprehensions were expressed both in 2014, 2019. And yet this happened supported by the intellectuals, by the people who have money and assets in this country. So the reason is, and the question is, why did we support these forces even when we knew that this is the situation that they're going to bring us into?
Well, one obvious answer is that people were dissatisfied with the previous dispensation. To my mind, always the promise of democracy is that you can throw out a government you don't like. And I think that government deserved to be thrown out. Does that mean we turn to the kind of people we have today? Unfortunately, that's the peril that we landed ourselves in. But, you know, it doesn't. So today, the imperative to me, if there is another election, which there may be doubt about, but if there is another election, the imperative is to throw out this government. What do we get after that? Might be worse, might be better, but that's what democracy gives us.
Thank you for that question. Dilip, this is something I wanted to say in relation to your point about, vote them out. As I said, I don't think that one should be just saying things like, well, it's all the same. How does it matter whether the Congress is here, whether it's the continuity thesis is facile. There has been a rupture. But on the other hand, we also do have to say, what about the fact that the landscape is so arid? And that actually, there are people in my family who are basically kind of decent people who I know probably voted BJP because they didn't want to vote the Congress back in. And I don't think that it's enough to just say, vote in, vote out, vote in, vote out. It's more than a vote, that a culture of dissent also eventually leads to real alternatives. I mean, America is in much the same situation where, Democrats may not bring sufficient change and may lead to, again, another backlash. And we can't be living in a situation where it's just vote in, vote out, much of the same. And I think the question before us is how do you develop real alternatives, a real third force that people can vote for happily?
I wanted to say something, and that is that in our polity and our democratic processes, no one has mentioned religion. And the indoctrination of half the population of this country is that you have been under the Muslims for 800 years or 1,000 years, and you better react. And they have been waiting for these 70 years after independence to come to power and to see that this particular indoctrination has practical results. And there is also this aggression that we are strong, we will, whether it's Balakot, whatever it is a symptom of our sinews and our strength. So that thing should not be forgotten.
Any of you like to respond?
Can I add one last question to that?
Quick question.
Sir, this is a question for you. You mentioned about vote them out. But people have lost faith in the EVMs, I think. Even political parties have lost faith. And the Supreme Court even is taking no action in that.
So,
Okay.
no, I'm saying just use the mic.
Okay. I think what I mentioned is that you said vote them out. But I think the political parties as well as the populace has lost the faith in the EVM.
So what do we do if we've
So
lost
if we
faith?
cannot vote them out, we vote to somebody, vote goes to somebody else. Okay, and another, just one question. To the lady, you mentioned the sad plight of the chief democracies of the world, Britain, Kripal case, United States, Trump. Who decides policy? Is it the permanent state, or what they call as the deep state, or the elected person, elected president? Here in India, of course, I don't have to say anything.
Final statements? If you don't mind, each of you.
Okay, final statements. As a moderator, I take the privilege of going last.
But you were asked a question.
Yeah, well, about the EVMs. Frankly, my personal opinion about that, sir, I have to admit I haven't studied it in any detail. Is that I think the fear about EVMs is exaggerated. There are possibilities, I'm sure, of faking them, but I don't think that has happened on enough of a scale to affect the elections. I could be wrong, but that's my current impression. Okay, so final statement.
I think I'll just want to build on the another fact that was mentioned earlier, that the difference between, it is probably what made Priyamvada say that we are leading the way. The fact is that our institutions are not working, that we know now, and which is not the case in many of the Western democracies which are going through the same process in the US and elsewhere. We can see their institutions standing up, especially their media. And that's not something that we see here. So it's essentially, it falls on us citizens who are worried about the situation to step up.
Having said that those are polarized societies and that's a good thing, Tony, I would say that their media is pretty bad. And if, for instance, Boris Johnson comes back in as Prime Minister, which he might, it'll be because 9/10 of the media have participated in disseminating lies over and over again. That's not a significantly better media picture, only marginally so. The only thing I will say is this, about the deep state, etc. I'm not a theorist of the deep state, and I'm kind of slightly suspicious of the emphasis on that sort of thing. Who makes the decision? Money makes the decision. Whether it's here or there, big money, there is big money sloshing around the political sphere, and big money is running the show, big capital is running the show, often the very same parties, both here and there. My hope, and this I want to end on a note of hope because I've been so gloomy, all countries have dissident traditions. Strong, powerful dissident traditions. Sometimes they're visible, at other times they're buried. And what I would hope is that whether in Britain or in America, which has great dissident traditions, or India, which has amazing dissident traditions, I really hope that we can find a way to make those come to the fore, because without dissent, there is no democracy.
In fact, dissent is the essence of democracy. There is nothing. We talk about majority, but no, it's the voice of it's the guarantee that everybody gets heard. Those dissenting voices too. We're done. So thank you. Wasn't me.
That's a quick answer. Thank you very much, Dilip D'Souza, Tony, Joseph, and Priyamvada Gopal for an outstanding session.